so the first thing I'll do is kind of give you a little introduction into human rights themselves. What are they, and what are some of the international law documents that we have which create a lot of human rights and are used when we're drafting a lot of our constitutions, because there's a lot of, we kind of look at what those international human rights documents say and put some of those provisions into our Bill of Rights. Then I'm going to look at disability issues. So one of the issues that we're going to explore today is, why is disability considered a human rights issue? And I really think that it is. It's kind of like the new, what I see as the new and emerging area in human rights law. And then I'm going to kind of take you through the CRPD. I know that most of you all know a lot about it, so I'm just going to give you like a chart that will help you understand it and get through the articles a little bit quickly, because it's pretty long. And after that, we're going to look at, well, what is Trinidad and Tobago's position in relation to the CRPD, because I understand that a lot of people are kind of confused as to how we have all of these provisions, which sound really good in the CRPD, but then when we come to look at the reality of Trinidad and Tobago, there's a lot of disconnect there. And I'm also going to try to identify some of the laws that we have on our statute books that either help people with disabilities or foster a lot of discrimination with respect to persons with disabilities. And then the last thing that we're going to do in the PowerPoint is kind of consider what could be your role as parents and as advocates for persons with disabilities, right? So the first topic that we're going to look at is basically, what are human rights? So describing what human rights are is not the easiest thing to do. And if you look at a lot of the literature about human rights and human rights law, you will see human rights being described in, really lofty, feel-good kind of language. So some people say, to deny people their human rights is to challenge their humanity. Other people say that human rights are like the theology of the modern world. I think that the best way to understand what human rights is to say that human rights are the rights that we all have simply by virtue of being human. And I know that sounds simplistic, and it also sounds like circular reasoning, but that is the best description as to what it is. And even if we can't pin down what exactly are human rights, the good thing is that if we look at the history of the development of human rights law, we see a lot of texts which kind of describe what is the content of the human rights that we all have. So that even though it may be hard for me to pin down and define what is a human right in a philosophical sense, it is not difficult for people to understand what are the rights that we all have because we're human. So a lot of people think that human rights is this modern liberal invention. It really isn't. If you go as far back as that Cyrus cylinder, which is like, it's considered to be the first human rights document. There's a document called the Cyrus Cylinder. And that document dates back to 539 BC. And it basically, is that better? Yeah. So basically, it was a document that was devised by King Cyrus the Great, right? He is this ancient king in Persia, so you know that it's really old, right? Because that country doesn't even exist anymore. And Persia conquered Babylon. Again, you know that we are talking about a long, long time ago, because Babylon doesn't exist either. And when King Cyrus conquered Babylon, he realized that there were a lot of people who were enslaved, and there was a lot of inequality in the society. So one of the first things that he did is kind of write down a decree, which is on this kind of clay cylinder, because I guess they didn't have paper at that time. And he said that people are supposed to be free and equal. They're supposed to have the right to choose their own religion. And he also established a lot of racial equality, so that cylinder, that clay cylinder, and those inscriptions on it is considered to be kind of like the first human rights document in, the history of mankind, basically. The next thing that happens is that after the world wars, so World War I and World War II, we see a lot of nations coming together on the international plane to deal with human rights. And that's where we get this concept of an international Bill of Rights. So we have a Bill of Rights that's in our Constitution, and the Constitution we know is the supreme law of Trinidad and Tobago, but you also have a Bill of Rights, which is those three documents put together. You also have a Bill of Rights in international law, but as I explained to you yesterday, the difficulty with international law is that it doesn't have effect in the domestic jurisdiction. So these rights are rights that have been recognized by all of the countries that form the United Nations, that group and that body, but you cannot say, okay, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says I have the right to life, and I'm going to sue the government of Trinidad and Tobago for violating that right. All that those international documents mean is that the international community has come together and they have promised that they will ensure that their citizens and persons who are global citizens, because there are some people who, migrate and so on, that they will ensure that all of humanity has this basic flow of rights. So the first thing that happens is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that document has been used a lot to draft Caribbean constitutions and constitutions throughout the world. And it talks about the fact that human beings are free, that we all have dignity, that we all have rights. It also talks about the right to life, the right to equality, the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and a lot of these things are things that we saw when we were looking at Section 4 of our Constitution yesterday, right? So they didn't just dream it up. They got it from these international documents. It also talks about the right to leisure, which I always find interesting. So people actually have a right to relax and enjoy their lives, which we don't think about enough, I think. People have a right to education, they have a right to work, they have a right to a basic standard of living, and those three rights mean a lot if you are a person with a disability, because if we figure out a way to get those rights accomplished in a way that will help persons with disabilities, there'll be a huge improvement in terms of the discrimination and stigmatization that they're currently facing in Trinidad and Tobago, and I think throughout the world. And a lot of people ask me, well, if we have this International Bill of Rights, why do we need documents like the CRPD? So even though we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, just 1 second, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which talks about things like the right to vote, the right to form a political party, freedom of association and freedom of assembly, and then you have the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which talks about the right to culture, the right to participate in sport, the right to leisure, and so on. You still have specialized human rights treaties. So the first one was the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and then the one that is most prominent in the 21st century, it's actually the only human rights document of the 21st century, is the CRPD. And the reason why we have those specialized treaties is because what those treaties do is tell us what the right to education, the right to work, the right to health, what do those things mean in the context of a person with a disability? So it's not creating a new right. It's taking it as a given that these rights exist. But when we talk about the right to education and we're looking at a person with a disability, what does that right mean to him or her? And that's why when you go to the CRPD, you will see them talking about inclusive education, as opposed to the International Bill of Rights, which just says there is a right to education, that everybody should be able to access primary, secondary, and if they want tertiary education. Yeah? So does everybody follow that? So all of those documents work together, but what the CRPD does is kind of drill down a little bit deeper and tell you what the rights mean and what is the basic content of those rights if you are a person with a disability. So the rights that we have in our Constitution are called first generation rights. They are mostly civil and political rights. That's why you see a lot of things like freedom of the press to form a political party, freedom of speech, freedom of thought and expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom of movement. Those things are civil and political rights, and that's the first set of rights that were actually recognized in international human rights law, which is where we get the content of our Bill of Rights from. Over time, though, people have realized that, okay, it's good to tell me that I have the right to form a political party, I have the right to freely associate and assemble, I have the right to express my thoughts and my opinions, my religion, but if I don't have certain basic necessities, I'm not going to be able to exercise those rights. So that's why you saw over time another movement in international human rights law saying, listen, in order to enjoy those civil and political rights, which are first generation rights, first we have to satisfy the socio-economic rights, which are second generation rights. And that's where you get things like the right to work and the right to education, the right to health care, the right to housing. The problem with those, and therefore you will only see those rights in constitutions that were drafted later on in the 20th century. So you see it in Belize, you see it in Guyana, you see it in South Africa. So the South African constitution is the most progressive in the world because they talk about things like the rights for the state to provide you with a house. Right? You have that right in your constitution, and the state is supposed to put resources into providing housing for all of its citizens. The problem with socio-economic rights, and I think why up to now we have not put them in our constitution, is that they require resources. So the state has to set aside a lot of its national resources in order to ensure that those rights are fulfilled. And a lot of states don't want to do that because then you're on the hook, right? If you amend the Bill of Rights and you say that people have the right to work, people have the right to education, people have the right to health care, people have the right to housing. You now, as the state, have to put aside resources to make sure that we have first-class education, first-class health care, that everybody who wants to work can, and that everybody who needs a house and cannot afford to go to RBC and Republic Bank can get access to housing. And that is not easy to do, and that's why a lot of states are not willing to go that route. Because even in Guyana, for example, a lot of people say, yes, the Constitution sounds really good. You know, when you read it through, you're like, wow, look at how many rights the Guyanese government has recognized for its citizens. But getting those rights in reality is difficult because it requires money. And there is also a lot of debate, even among attorneys, as to whether those things like the right to work is an actual right. Because a lot of people think, well, why don't you just go to school and get a job? Why do you really need the state to provide you with a job? If you go to school, you study hard, you do well, you will get a job, you will get a house, you will be able to afford health care. So why does the state have to set aside resources in order to enable you to do that? Yeah, so there's a lot of debate about whether socio-economic rights are even human rights. Or are we just, trying to be liberal and make things sound good without thinking about it from a practical perspective? Right, so the next thing is that we're going to look at is basically why do we consider disability a human rights issue? And I want to ask you all if you think it is. Do you think that the issues that persons with disabilities are facing, do you think they are human rights issues? So if you were to look at the history of the world, you will realize that people with disabilities have really been discriminated against and treated in a way that really, really violates the concept that life is sacred. So if you were to do any kind of reading about human rights law, you will come across this guy's name, right? Aristotle. Aristotle is a famous philosopher from Greece, ancient Greece. He is considered as the person who came up with this theory called natural law theory. And basically, right? I see people shaking their heads, right? So basically what natural law theory does is kind of play into what you're talking about, Loretta. Say that as human beings, we live in a state of nature that is civilized, and we have to treat each other in a particular kind of way. But if you look at Aristotle through the lens of disability, you probably won't think that he was that great a theorist after all, because he actually believed in infanticide, and that still happens today. A lot of people who have children with disabilities think that something is wrong with them. I've heard people in Trinidad and Tobago, parents tell me how people have told them that somebody work OB on your child, and right? It is foolishness, but there are people who actually believe that. And if you go and carry the child by this guy and do this thing, the child is going to be fixed, right? All of that plays into what Aristotle is talking about, which is that if you have a disability, something is wrong with you. And therefore, the idea that your life is sacred doesn't apply, because you are not even to be considered a human being or given the chance to live. So he thought that it was okay to kill for parents or the society to get rid of those children. And that's actually what happened a lot with Hitler and the Jews, right? A lot of people with disabilities were killed out, and that is happening still today in rural areas. It happens a lot in India, right? Yeah, so that still happens, right? So from Aristotle till now, that has not been eliminated completely. The next thing that we have is institutionalization, which again is something that still happens. So if you look up in the dictionary the word bedlam, you will see that it is a word that is associated with a lot of chaos and madness. We got that word because of this hospital, which was run in the United Kingdom. And, we always like to think that the US and the UK are first world civilized nations. But if you look at their history, a lot of the things that they did to people will surprise you, right? So there was this hospital, and basically it was an institution to treat people who were adjudged to be insane. People ended up there who were not insane at all. A lot of women ended up there when their husbands wanted to divorce them and marry somebody else. And the husband will say, well, my wife is crazy, and have her committed to this institution even though absolutely nothing is wrong with her, right? And there are a lot of human rights abuses that went on in this place. So that picture there is of an American serviceman who, again, his name is James Norris, and he was not crazy. He ended up getting injured, and I guess because of his injury, he was acting out, and they got him committed as an insane person, and he ended up in this insane asylum. And the conditions were filthy. He had to wear this kind of metal contraption which kept you up upright all of the time. And basically what they did is that every time he misbehaved, they would adjust it so it would become tighter and tighter and tighter. So the US authorities eventually found out that this American serviceman was being kept there and got him released. But things didn't end too well for him because as soon as they took that metal contraption off, his body kind of burst and he ended up dying. But the conditions in Bedlam, they used to do things like bloodletting, which is making people do blood transfusions because they thought that insanity is something that was inherent in your blood. And so if we got all that insane blood out of your system, you would be cured. Another thing that they did a lot, which is things that still happen to people with disabilities, is forced feeding or starvation. So using food as a reward, right? Which basically is treating people like if they're in a zoo. And this really was a zoo because what a lot of rich, aristocratic British people used to do to give money to the hospital or as a way of raising funds to run the hospital was to allow those rich British people to come to the hospital and kind of look at the patients, you know, in amazement as though they are creatures of, you know, and I've never seen anything like that before. And they used to have a lot of tours where you would go around and get to see them in their cages and so on, just like how we visit the zoo today, right? The next thing that happens, and I wanted to bring up this case because it's not in the Middle Ages, right? It's from the US, it's in the 1920s, and the decision is written by one of the judges who is probably the most revered US constitutional judge ever, even up until today, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. There is this case called Buck v. Bell. It's a US constitutional law case. And basically what happened to this young woman called Carrie Buck, who people thought was feeble-minded, it turned out in the end that nothing was wrong with her. Right? She had a normal IQ and she did not have any kind of intellectual disability. But her family members brought her to the attention of the state authorities because she got pregnant outside of marriage, right? Which, I mean, even up until today, I think there are people who think that that is so wrong and, you know, I don't want to get into all of that. But that mentality has not been removed from society up to now. And what they wanted to do was to get her forcibly sterilized. So they were going to remove her ability to have children against her will. And the reason why they wanted to do that is because the state of Virginia, which is where she lived, they allowed people with disabilities, they allowed their family members to bring them in for this forcible sterilization procedure to be carried out, right? So Carrie Buck's mother was allegedly also a person with an intellectual disability. Carrie Buck had an intellectual disability, and the child that she ended up having had an intellectual disability as well. That's how the story went. So they were thinking, listen, we need to stop Carrie Buck from reproducing, because every time the Bucks have a kid, it ends up being a child with an intellectual disability. So I'm actually doing something good for society. Just like what Aristotle thought, it is good for society to remove persons who have disabilities because they are not considered perfect human beings and they can't contribute to society in the way that an able-bodied person can do. So Carrie Buck's attorneys, people found out about what was going to happen to her and they took her case pro bono all the way to the US Supreme Court. And what they were arguing is that that law in Virginia that allows the state to sterilize you against your will if you have a disability is unconstitutional. It violates the right to equal protection because it does not apply to people who don't have a disability. It only applies to people with a disability. So right there and then you see the element of discrimination. Interestingly enough, she didn't win her case, right? Oliver Wendell Holmes, this famed US constitutional law scholar, graduate of Harvard Law School and has, a hall and a building named after him there and a big statue in marble. This is what he said about persons with disabilities, that we should not allow them to reproduce because 3 generations of stupid people is enough, and that it was basically better and it's in the public interest to stop those kinds of persons from reproducing as opposed to allowing them to reproduce. And his father was a famous doctor. So that just goes to show, we tend to think that if you're educated and you went to the best schools and you went to the Ivy League, that you're going to have a certain mindset. That is not true, right? So eventually, this is years later, Virginia actually abolished that statue. And if you visit Virginia today, there is a statue erected in honor of Carrie Buck. So the state actually apologized to her and her family for what was done because they eventually realized that it was wrong, even though they didn't think it was wrong back in the 1920s. Yeah? And again, this is something that a debate that people are having even today. It may sound strange to us because we are so intimately familiar with people with disabilities, but there are a lot of people who think that it would be better for society if we don't have persons with disabilities around. They are a drain on resources. They make life very difficult for their parents and contribute to a lot of mental health problems with respect to parents with disabilities. And it will be better for the world if we allow people who we know are already perfect and have a certain flow of capability to reproduce and to get into government and get into positions of power. There are a lot of people who think that way, especially because of climate change and the increase in the world's population and the drain on resources that is being affected by the amount of people that we have in the world today. Children are at high risk of violence, right? Sexual violence, physical violence, right? Things like beating if you don't know your times tables and so on, which we really should not do, but we still do, and we do it even worse to children with disabilities. Look at how high the rates are for them. 4 times more likely to experience violence. If you have an intellectual disability, it's worse. 4.6 times more likely to experience sexual violence as opposed to a child that doesn't have a disability. Even when you become an adult, that risk doesn't go away. I think a lot of people think, well, you're grown, you can take care of yourself, you're supposed to have sense by now. No. Adults, grown women get into violent situations, right? Adults with disabilities are even more vulnerable than them. And if you have a mental health problem, look at how high the statistic is. You're 4 times more likely to experience some kind of violence as opposed to a normal functioning adult. And I know that this conversation is difficult and emotional, and these statistics could really make you feel really depressed because it really paints a pretty grim picture in terms of what people with disabilities are facing and how huge the task is that we, and I'm saying we because I'm including myself, all of us have to change what is happening. That is not easy, but it can be done. It's not impossible. This famous saying, nothing is impossible, that is true. Even though something is really, really hard, it's not impossible to change it, right? And I really think that at a certain point in this country, we're going to reach a tipping point where people just can't take it anymore and something will have to give. That's why we're having those riots in Port of Spain with people blocking the road, because people are reaching to a point where it's too much pressure and it has to find some kind of outlet, right? And that is going to happen, I believe, in the disability community, right? So if you were to look at kind of the lot that persons with disabilities have to face, it makes a lot of sense to have a specialized human rights treaty dealing just with persons with disabilities, right? Which is where we get to the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And this is where the convention was actually being read on the floor of the United Nations and put to a vote. That's where this picture comes from. And as you could see, the person who is doing it, right, is not, it's a person with a disability. So that's why I was telling you all that this conversation that we keep having about, well, what is happening with the national policy on disabilities? My document is saying 2016, you're saying 2015, the other one is saying 2017, when it's the next consultation. That is not supposed to be happening, because the entire ethos of the CRPD is nothing about us without us. And this picture is a perfect representation of that. You cannot do policy or laws or regulations. Nothing that will affect a person with disability can be done without the actual inputs of stakeholders or people with disabilities themselves, right? Because another thing that I notice when I go to a lot of these consultations is that I don't see a lot of people who actually have disabilities. I see a lot of people who care about people with disabilities, or who have a family member, or who are a parent, or who have formed an NGO, but I am yet to interact with or go to a workshop where everybody I'm sitting down looking at is a person with a disability. And that in and of itself tells me we have a problem. You know, Houston, we have a problem. Because we have to find a way to make sure that someday this person could be in our parliament, this person could be our prime minister or president, right? Can that happen with the state of play that we have in Trinidad and Tobago right now? The answer is no, right? So the CRPD is a pretty historic document, and a lot of people don't realize that it's the first human rights treaty of the 21st century. This is the first time that the international community came together to think about what human rights mean in the context of a disability. And the third bullet point is really important. People with disabilities, NGOs, disabled persons organizations, all of them came together to actually draft it and tell the United Nations what they want to have in that convention. And that's why it is so progressive. And that's why it also really, really addresses a lot of the issues that people with disabilities face in their day-to-day lives, because they got a chance to say what they want. Look, this is my issue. When I try to go to school, the school keeps telling me I can't come there. Or they keep sending me off to this other school where everybody has a disability. So I don't have one friend who doesn't have a disability, right? That's why you'll see things like inclusive education, or even health, or participating in sports. All of those rights came to being because persons with disabilities, or NGOs, or disabled persons organizations themselves sat down and got an opportunity. And I'm repeating that again because that is what we are going through right now in Trinidad and Tobago with the national policy for disabilities. So compare how the CRPD was drafted and look at the end product that it produced to how this national policy is being drafted and the product that is being produced. But we're being told, officially or unofficially, that the national policy and the CRPD are like this, whereas I see it like this, with the CRPD here and the national policy somewhere down there, right? Because I don't understand, if you want to draft a policy to implement the CRPD, why don't you look at how they came up with the CRPD in the first place and try to replicate that in our, as best as we can in our local situation and context, right? Another thing that you will see, and again, this has to be because the people who were writing the words of the CRPD knew what they were doing, either because they know what their lived experiences are, or they have a lot of knowledge about disability law, disability policy, or just basic common sense, right? What the CRPD does is really change the mold as to how we view people with disabilities. The oldest and the most traditional way to view a person with a disability is to say that that person, we have to feel sorry for them. And therefore we have to invest a lot in charity because this person with a disability, they are so pitiful that we have to give them a lot of charity and grants and view them as an object of pity and compassion. The next thing that we do, which is what I realize really is happening, and we are still stuck there, charity or the medical model. The next thing, and the other most traditional way of viewing a person with a disability, is to say that something is wrong with them. And if I apply enough medical interventions, I'm going to fix them and get rid of that disability or that mutation that they have. So if I invest enough money in medical treatments, somehow after a while, if I have enough medical interventions, that disability is going to go away because a disability is a medical problem, right? So it's either we treat them as objects of charity or we treat them as health experiments, right, that we're trying to fix. The CRPD has done away with that completely because what it says now is that when you are looking at a person with a disability, you're supposed to be looking at them through the lens of the social model or what is called a human rights model. So what the social model says is that I only have a disability because I am in an environment that cannot accommodate me. If I were in an environment that could accommodate me, I wouldn't have a disability. A lot of people think that that is hard to understand, but I see a lot of people who are wearing glasses. So what I'm going to ask all of the glasses wearing people to do is to take your glasses off. Yeah? And now read the slide for me. The last one, the smallest. What does it say? And the only reason that you can't read it is because you're not wearing your glasses. So you are in an environment right now with your glasses off that cannot accommodate the fact that you don't have what it is, 20/20 vision. But if you put the glasses back on, right, now we're in an environment that could accommodate the fact that you don't have 20/20 vision. That is what the social model is about. The only reason or the rationale behind saying, look, this person has a disability and cannot function is because we're putting them in an environment where they will not be able to function. The next thing that the CRPD has done is also say not just that disability is a social problem, it's a human rights problem as well. So whenever we are having conversations about disability issues, we are really having human rights conversations. So we are not asking for a handout or please help us. What we are doing is demanding that you recognize and enforce the rights that we have as human beings, which goes back to the point that we were making earlier on about looking at things more holistically. I think a lot of people think that dealing with disabilities is really isolating, or that if I have a child with a disability, I look around and I don't see anybody else going through what I'm going through. That's not true. The CRPD, another reason why it is historic, is because it got the most signatories ever for any international human rights document. Right? The first country to sign and ratify it, which means that they made it a binding commitment in international law, was Jamaica. Right? So we like to think about, well, the Caribbean is so backward. No, not really, right? The only country that has not signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child is two countries, the US and Somalia, right? So we need to get out of this third world, first world kind of frame of mind or pushback when people try to tell us, well, Trinidad and Tobago is a third world country, so what do you really expect? Yeah, this map shows you how widespread there is agreement about the rights of persons with disabilities and about the content of the CRPD. So the blue boxes are people who have signed and ratified. So anytime you see blue on the map, and I'm going to give you this PowerPoint as well, that would be people who have signed and ratified the convention, which means that for them, it is a binding international document, and we are in the blue now, right, since we ratified it. The red are people who have signed and ratified not just the convention, but also the optional protocol, which I will explain to you a little bit later on in terms of why do we have that optional protocol and why it is really, really important for Trinidad and Tobago to finally sign on to it and ratify it, because it will make some kind of difference in terms of the problems that we're having with the disconnect between what is in the CRPD and what we are experiencing in Trinidad and Tobago, right? So as of this particular point in time, we have 160 states who have signed the CRPD. 174 have signed it and ratified it. 92 have signed both the CRPD and the optional protocol. So disability is an issue that most people identify with. And as I told you, every time I tell people that my interest is in disability law, they always tell me, oh, I went to school with somebody who had a disability, or my neighbor's son has a disability, or when I go to church, I see this little girl and I think she has a disability, right? Disability is not, some peripheral little thing that we push to the side. It's more widespread than we think it is. And what we need to do is figure out a way to get national attention drawn to it as an issue. Yeah? So when you are reading through the CRPD, I know it's, pretty weighty. It's not, 5-10 pages. If you use this kind of roadmap, you'll get through it a little bit quicker. So you have the preamble, which again we know is just like the Constitution. Why? Because constitutions are based on international human rights treaties, right? So you have the preamble, which basically tells you it sets the framework of what is this CRPD about. So if you look through the preamble, you will see things like the inherent dignity of persons with disabilities, their autonomy, which means that they are human beings, have a mind of their own, have feelings, and are able to make decisions of their own. It talks about their independence. It talks about not discriminating against them, about creating a society that includes them, where they could participate. It talks about respecting that persons with disabilities are different, or that we may not function the same way that they do, but that's okay, because that's what makes life interesting and that's what contributes to human diversity, right? I wouldn't want to live in a world where everybody is like me. I don't think that anybody here would want to live in a world where everybody is just like you. That would be pretty boring, I think, right? And we'll probably get on each other's nerves because we will be too similar. So you need diversity in life and in human experience. The preamble also talks about equality of opportunity, right? Which we'll get to a little bit later when we talk about the Equal Opportunity Act. And it talks about things like accessibility. The next thing that you see is kind of the introductory articles and what the general principles of the CRPD are. And again, that is also giving you kind of like a broad thematic structure in order to understand the more substantive rights that are contained there. So if you look at the general obligations, for example, you will see that the states who have signed and ratified the CRPD have certain obligations. Number one is to review laws and policies, right? Number two is to provide funding to assist in making sure that there are technologies and accommodations for persons with disabilities. The third one is to make goods and services accessible to persons with disabilities. The next one is to raise awareness about persons with disabilities. These are obligations that every state who signs and ratifies the CRPD, this is what you've signed up for. The next thing that you're supposed to do is do a lot of training efforts to assist people in how to interact with a person with a disability. And then the last thing you're supposed to do is to build capacity, which means that there's supposed to be a lot of cooperation internationally about disability issues. So we are supposed to be looking at, well, the US did this, Jamaica has done that. Let's try and find out what they did. And let's try to get somebody from Jamaica here to look at what we are doing and see how we could make it better. So, and that person from Jamaica could go back home and maybe think about what they are doing and make that even better than what they had before, right? Query, is that happening? Which one of those things is happening? Reviewing existing laws and policies, providing funding, making goods and services accessible, raising awareness, training people, and then the last one is collecting data. So we have reviewing existing laws and policies. That's the first one. The next one is to provide funding. So a lot of people realize that if you have technology, it's a lot easier for persons with disabilities. So I think Michelle was telling us about her son who has problems with handwriting. But if you put him in front of a computer, I'm sure he doesn't type like that. Yeah, but no, I am telling you, he's going to take off because all that has been done is that you have taken him out of an environment that is not right for him and put him into one that's better, right? Which is good because when you think about it, when you go abroad, nobody writes, Even when you go to college in the States, you don't do written exams. You have to do the exams on a computer. Yeah, he's probably more adept. Yeah, right. So providing funding in terms of technological interventions, that is the second one, right? The third one is to make goods and services, which will go to your transportation point, making goods and services accessible. The other one is to raise awareness of the plight of persons with disabilities in order to get people to understand and accept it and stop treating them like if they're weird and trying to isolate them, right? The next one is to do a lot of training with NGOs, civil society, and so on. Go into job places, schools, right, to train people, which I guess is the point that you're making, the training that's happening now to deal with children with disabilities. And then the last thing is capacity building, which is where you're fostering a lot of transfer of knowledge from persons in the international community who have looked at this issue before and could kind of help you figure out what you need to do, right? So maybe some of the things are being done. I really thought that you all were going to tell me no. The last time I asked people, they told me no. But that was like last year. So maybe we're getting there slowly but surely. Yeah? Then the next, which will be 1, 2, 3, 4. Right, the fifth one across is the substantive articles, which will be from Article 5 to Article 30. If you look through those articles, you will see that that's really like the nitty-gritty of the CRPD, because it spells out all of the rights that you are supposed to, that you have as a person with a disability. And it also tells you what is the content of that right. So it's well enough to tell me, well, you have the right to health care. But if I'm a person with a disability, what does that mean? What does that right to health care mean for me, right? So if you were to look through the substantive provisions, right, this is from 5 to 30, these are kind of the rights that you will see. And why I put it up there is because I think it's interesting to look at those rights and then go back to section 4 and see what we have, to do some kind of compare and contrast. So do you see a lot of overlap between section 4 of the Constitution and the CRPD? Or if we were to change section 4, what are some of the things that we might think, right? Yeah, so if you were to put those two documents side by side and do a little bit of comparing and contrasting, that could be another thing that you could push for, you know, that, okay, maybe you don't want to give me disability rights. When we are having all of these conversations, which we are always having, about constitutional reform, why don't we ever have a section dealing with reform in the Constitution from the perspective of disability? Yeah? So you will see a lot of overlap, but you'll also see a lot of things that are not in the Constitution, right? Everybody's gone through that one, because there are 2 slides, because there are so many rights, which in and of itself should tell you that if you compare 4 and you compare the CRPD, you know, you're going to see overlap, but not that much, because the CRPD is way more detailed. And this is the other set of rights. So you see things like work and employment, which I think is really important for persons with disabilities, respecting their privacy, right? Just because you are a person with a disability doesn't mean that you don't have feelings, or you know, don't want your privacy respected just like anybody else. Respecting their right to access to information. So, you know, we always tell people, well, go and Google things, or go and look on my website. Is the website accessible? If you have a visually impaired person trying to go and look at what you're talking about. Then education and healthcare, which again, I think are really big issues in Trinidad and Tobago, you know. My personal belief is if we get education right, everything could flow from there, because you really cannot get anywhere in life if you don't have an education. If you really look at how the CRPD envisions implementation, it makes a lot of sense, because what it says is that, listen, we are going to monitor implementation of this convention on 2 levels. The first one is the international level, which is where states have a mandatory obligation to submit a report to the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And what that report is supposed to do is go through every single article of the CRPD and tell me, what are you doing to implement this particular article, right? So there is some obligation that is placed on the state. It's not good enough for you to just sign the document and walk away. The UN has set up a structure to monitor what you are doing and if you're honoring your word, basically. The next thing that they have done on the international level is to not only have a convention, but to have an optional protocol. And what that optional protocol provides for, and this is a part that we have not signed on to, is to allow individuals with disabilities to actually file a complaint with the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So if you look at all of those death penalty cases where people are filing petitions with those human rights bodies in the UN, they are able to do that because Trinidad and Tobago, or whatever state you're looking at, has signed on to something that is akin to this optional protocol. We haven't signed that yet, but when we do, what it will enable persons to do is to say, I have a child with a disability and I can't get housing. Or I have a child with a disability and that child is being told you cannot attend this school. Or I am a person with a disability and I went for a job with the Ministry of Education. They asked me all this stuff about if I would be safe here, and then they didn't give me the job, right? Which is the reverse of what happened to the individual you were dealing with. Those people will now be able to say, look, I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to get this to the attention of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and I'm going to file a petition with them to say Trinidad and Tobago is violating this provision of the CRPD. And there's going to be a hearing where the committee is going to give you a decision about whether that provision of the CRPD has been violated or not, right? And if you think about the optional protocol, you will understand why Trinidad and Tobago is not going to sign up for that, right? Because it's going to cause, I think, in their minds, a lot of embarrassment when they have all of these persons filing petitions and constantly having decisions being issued by this committee saying, you're not honoring your international obligation, you're not honoring it, you're not honoring it. Because in the death penalty cases, eventually Trinidad and Tobago withdrew from a lot of those human rights bodies for that same reason. They don't want that international embarrassment, right? But when the optional protocol really gives the CRPD a lot of teeth. But again, that's in international law. It's not going to affect domestic law, right? It's not going to affect what happens at the Hall of Justice or the Privy Council because it's a different plane of law that we're dealing with. Right? Before I take a question, I just want to make one other point, which is about monitoring, not just on the international level, but on the national level as well. So Trinidad and Tobago is supposed to have set up some kind of focal point, and because disability is such a cross-cutting issue, it's supposed to be comprised of people with all kinds of different expertise to come up with a way to implement the CRPD. And if we do that, then Teresina, the point that you are making about always having a person with a disability on this committee, it would be kind of easy to do because you would already be able to draw somebody from that national body that has been set up to make the CRPD a reality in the country itself. So the last thing that I wanted to focus on before we go to the break is kind of what is Trinidad and Tobago's position, because I think a lot of people, when they go to these talks about the CRPD, it's like, what? So then why am I having this problem? What is going on? I don't understand, right? So this is kind of to help you bridge that gap. Trinidad and Tobago signed the CRPD. We didn't ratify it until 2015, right? So it took us about, I think, 7 years, 9 years, because we signed it in 2006. We only ratified it in 2015. And it's only when you ratify a treaty that it becomes binding in international law. The other thing that you have to know is because we have a legal system that is called a dualist system, which means that we view international law and domestic law as two separate bodies of law. There are some countries that don't view it like that. We do. What that means is that in order for the CRPD to have any effect in the legal structure or the legal system of Trinidad and Tobago, we have to now take that convention and make it an act. right? And we went through yesterday all of the stages in terms of how do policies and documents become legislation. That's what we have to do with the CRPD, and that's what I think the Ministry of Social Development wants to do with that national policy. Yeah, which is make the national policy their way of giving the CRPD domestic legal effect. Yeah? I also told you that we haven't signed on or ratified the optional protocol, right? We all know that we don't have any national mechanism or national disability laws or any mechanism to deal with persons who have disabilities and violation of their rights. And the next thing we also haven't done is submit the state reports. So when you sign the CRPD, you have an obligation to submit a report to the committee saying what you are doing to implement it. And our report was due in 2017 and it's not submitted. And we're not that strange in that regard. The only Caribbean country that's ever submitted a report is Haiti. Haiti? Yes. The only Caribbean country that has ever submitted that state report. And remember, I told you Jamaica signed and ratified the CRPD first, right? The only country that has ever submitted that state report in the Caribbean or CARICOM is Haiti, right? So we're not that odd. That is a problem with international law. It's hard to enforce it because you're dealing with states, and states are considered to be sovereign bodies, so you cannot police a state, right? That's the doctrine of international law. States are sovereign and you cannot violate their sovereignty, so you can't force them to do it. But I would think that, you know, if you signed and you ratified it, you must have known what you were signing up for, right? Somebody in Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of the Attorney General would have looked through the CRPD to see, look, do we really want to buy into this? You know, do we really want to sign up for these kinds of obligations? That's why, for example, the US has never signed the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, because they're not getting into that. That is too much stress for them. They want to go their own way and have their own laws to protect children and children's rights. They don't want to get into the regime of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Yeah? Okay? And they also have a lot of protection, like child and family services, right? So they don't have the convention, but they have something else. But my point is that I think, you know, as a state, you should honor your word. If you say that you sign in this treaty, you must have read it through and seen that you have this obligation. Well, why aren't you honoring it? If we were to look at the CRPD, and basically what I've tried to pull out is areas that I think from our conversations, there's probably a lot of consensus about things that we should change. So I heard a lot of people talking about health and education. I put in immigration and access to justice just to educate you about what is happening, because a lot of people might be surprised about some of the provisions that we actually have in those acts and how they are really backward looking in terms of dealing with persons with disabilities. So what I wanted to do is to kind of look at the act. So all of the slides are designed like this. And I changed the color. I think that's easier to look at. All of the slides are designed like this, where you have on, well, it will be my left, your right, the national legislation, the particular piece of legislation. So you have Health Act, Education Act, Immigration Act, and then you have what the CRPD says about that identical issue. So right there, and then you could do some kind of compare and contrast to see, okay, we have a Health Act. If I were to put it side by side with the CRPD, what would I see? And that's what I kind of want to get an idea from you all. So the Health Act, if you go it through, you don't see any provision dealing with health care for people with disabilities, right? Because of that, that's why we're having these problems in terms of accessing health care. And I think that's why we also have this deficit in terms of the numbers of professionals who are practicing in Trinidad and Tobago to deal with health and rehabilitation, right? There isn't a market for it. And the reason why there isn't a market for it is because the legislation that sets up our entire healthcare system, if you look it through, you won't really see any provisions dealing with speech therapy and water therapy and horseback riding. I think that's called equine. Right, hippotherapy, right? You're not going to see anything like that in there. So what I think we tried to do is to fix that deficit in the Health Act by saying, let's set up a center, so separate and apart from the healthcare system, which we all know is divided into different regional health authorities. Separate and apart from that, I think what the government tried to do is to set up a kind of parallel structure to just provide health care for persons with disabilities, which is what that I think, because trying to get information about that national center, and if anybody has any information that they're willing to share with us or with me, I really would appreciate it, because my trying to get information about it, where did it come about, what was the policy that they had in mind when they were setting it up, how many disabled organizations were consulted, how did they come up with the range of therapies that they want to offer, how is it going to work, is it free, how are you going to get there? I don't know. So please don't ask me those questions, because I'm in the same boat with you. And if anybody could answer that, I would really love to get the information myself. But all I know is that it really was supposed to provide health care and therapeutic services for people with disabilities. So they set it up in Carson Field, and it was opened, because that's when I go back into like newspaper archives, that's what I'm seeing. It actually was launched, but so it was open, but it never opened, right? So it's not operational. Like, I don't know if it is that you could go, I don't know. If they're right, I don't know if there are therapists there. I don't know if they are going to pull, if the intention is to pull maybe the therapist from like the Mount Pediatric facility. I don't know if the idea is that, right now I think if if you need healthcare services, even if you need to get diagnosed, you have to go through you could go through the public health system or do it privately or do it abroad, right? So I don't know if what they wanted to do is say, well, we're not going to allow that service to be offered at the different RHAs anymore. Instead, we're going to create one structure where everybody will go. It makes sense in a way, but I don't know what they were thinking, right? And the fact that you all don't know either is, I haven't come across anybody who actually knows what. But it sounds pretty good. National Enrichment Center. We are always good at those things, making it sound good and look good, but actually getting into the nitty-gritty, I don't know. So we know that that is kind of what we have, but if we put that up against Article 25, and Teresina was correct in pointing out to me that you could also look at Article 26, which deals with rehabilitation services. So 25 and 26 work together. 25 deals with health, and 26 deals with rehabilitation, right? If you look at it and you see kind of what those articles envision and you compare it to what we have in the Health Act, there's a disconnect there, right? It's a huge gap that we have, and we have to find a way to close it. So maybe one of the things that we could do is advocate not for a disability law, but for amendments to be made to the Health Act so that the Health Act could incorporate just those two articles, 25 and 26 from the CRPD, as opposed to trying to get a law to implement from Articles 4 to 30, right? And as I said, my role is to educate you and get you thinking. It's not to solve the problem or tell you what the answer is, to get you to think about what are some of the things that we could do together. Yeah? So the next area that I kind of wanted us to look at too was education, because that came up a lot. It came up a lot even today. And you know, this is kind of like my pet area, right? Because I really, really honestly believe, and you can disagree with me if you want. In fact, I'd like it if you would. Then I'll start to think more deeply about what I'm saying. Is that if we could figure out a way to get persons with disabilities access to education, that will make a huge difference in terms of the quality of the life that they have and the quality of the life that their parents have, because we don't tend to focus on that as much as we should, you know. And I also think that a lot of people have problems with admitting that I'm struggling, because they feel like maybe that means they're weak and they're not up to the task. But everybody struggles with something at some point, right? Nobody has the perfect life. Life isn't like that. So if we look through the Education Act, and we have a lot of people who actually have backgrounds in education here as well, so you all could feel free to join in at any point. What you will see is that the Ministry of Education does have a duty to provide schooling for all kids who are of, all children who are of compulsory school age. They have an obligation to make sure that there are public schools for those children to attend. When it comes to people who have disabilities, what the Act says, and that quotation is from the Act itself, right? So that's another disclaimer I should issue from now. In this presentation, every time you see those things in quotes, that's not my words. That is what is on the statute books or from some case or some piece of legislation. So what it says is that the public schools may, and I want you to focus on that word, because there is a difference in law when you are writing something and you say may or you say shall. May means you could do it if you want to. Shall means you don't have a choice. You have to do it, right? And that's supposed to trigger in our minds about the president and how he makes decisions, whether he has a choice or not, right? May and shall are the ordinary English words that lawyers have taken to indicate whether people have a discretion or not. So the fact that you're seeing may there, that alone is supposed to tell you something, right? So the public schools may include, and look at the wording, special schools, right? But look at what the CRPD is talking about. Tell me where in the CRPD side is seeing the word a special school, right? And we have student support services, which I think, again, just like National Enrichment Center, is not that we have nothing. We have something, but maybe the something that we have could be better, right? And we need to figure out a way to make it better. So things are a little bit better than we think we are. We don't have to construct the entire house. The house is built. All we have to do is make sure that we go to the right furniture store to get the furniture to put in the house. Yeah? So if you look at the CRPD, you'll see, again, a lot of disconnect between the Education Act and what the CRPD is talking about, because you will never see the word special school there. Why? Those schools encourage unknowingly or unknowingly, because I do take the point that it's better than having nothing. But if you look at those schools over time, what they do is actually facilitate people with disabilities being isolated from other people. And I think that one of the ways that we could change the conversation about disabilities or just normalize it is to maybe have a classroom with a disabled child and who with cerebral palsy, with one with autism, one who's deaf, one who has visual impairments, and everybody else. Somebody who wears glasses or somebody who's just perfectly fine. You know, if we get all of those kids in a classroom together and figure out a way to teach all of them or design a curriculum that will accommodate all of them, that will actually be better for persons with disabilities in the long run, because you will grow up not thinking of somebody with a disability as weird or strange. And you will also grow up understanding that humanity is very diverse. It is kind of boring to always be with people who are just like you. That's why I always tell my friends who are lawyers, get friends who are not lawyers. it will really change the way you view things. It's hard though, because lawyers, people don't like lawyers, one. And, we think and talk differently, but even if it's one friend you have who's not a lawyer, get a friend who does not practice law and line with that person, and you will see how much that will change your own perspective. When I was teaching at the university, one of the first things one of my colleagues told me is to do an evaluation for all of the people in my class. And I never thought about that, even though I studied this disability stuff for so long, right? Because what he said is that he did a course in teaching. And they told you that's the first thing you're supposed to do, because you have to figure out if your students are more visual or if they would respond better to text. And if you are doing a PowerPoint, which is something that I like to do because I think it gives you something to focus on and it helps me focus on what I have to cover as well. If you only have text on the screen, that's not going to reach everybody. But if you have a picture or a graph, or, figure out a way to teach everybody, and nobody who gave me back, because a lot of people didn't do it, right? Nobody who gave me back the paper told me they had a disability. But a lot of people told me I remember things better if I see it in a picture, as opposed to if you tell me it or if you have it in a bullet point or text or in a textbook, right? So changing the education system is going to help everybody, because people learn differently and absorb information differently. So it's not about, oh, we're trying to bring these kids and they're going to keep back the children who bright, and I have heard it all about why we can't put children with disabilities in a normal classroom environment. It can be done. We just have to figure out how to do it. And we also have to stop, which is what I hear happening a lot, kind of trying to demonize the special schools system, because if it weren't for them, what would we have? I mean, I'm not saying that they're perfect, but let us be real. If we didn't have the Princess Elizabeth, what would we have? Nothing. So I'm saying that, let us start to focus on the positive as opposed to always focusing on the negative, which is different from saying that we shouldn't criticize things and try to make it better. So I know health and education are really big, passion areas for everybody. And I agree with you all that those are two areas that people who have an interest in disability law or studies or whatever focus a lot on, because it really does make a huge difference in the life of a person with a disability. But I also wanted to draw to your attention what I will call like low-hanging fruit, right? Because remember, my role is to get you to think about what you can do to change what is happening. This is what is in our Immigration Act. And again, the quotation marks are deliberate, right? This is not me calling anybody an imbecile or an idiot or feeble-minded, right? And people don't know this, but this is what our Immigration Act says. Yes, if you fall into these categories, an immigration officer is not allowed to permit you to enter Trinidad and Tobago. So when we have all of these conferences and we fly people in from abroad who have disabilities to come and speak, that those people get to come here is by the grace of God or some immigration official, right? There is provision in the Immigration Act for you to get special permission. So if you are a prohibited immigrant, the minister could give you special permission to still come. So I'm not sure how people with disabilities from abroad actually get here. If it is that the immigration officer just decides not to apply that section, or if they go the route of approaching the minister and getting the permission from in advance, I really can't say. But this is in the Immigration Act of Trinidad and Tobago. And I would love for somebody to tell me how you can justify that. Even if you had it when we first got the Immigration Act, because the Immigration Act is one of those old colonial laws, right? Why do we have it in 2018? So a lot of these older acts would actually be acts that were formulated by the colonial authorities. And remember, when we became independent, we didn't get a blank sheet. So we kind of stuck with them, but that doesn't mean that we can't change them. Yeah? They're saved, but we could change it if we wanted to, right? And so these are what will this take? Will this take all of the work that we have to put into to get inclusive education, right? Probably not, right? This is an easy fix. So that's what I'm saying. These kind of things are what I would call from an advocacy perspective, low-hanging fruit. This is the other one I think is low-hanging fruit. We are having a whole conversation about the Jury Act. Should we still have jury trials, or should we do away with juries and let judges do all of the criminal trials themselves? And I have not heard one person talk about the discrimination in the Jury Act itself in terms of who can be a juror. And again, this is not, right? And if you look at this, and you look at this, right, it looks pretty similar, yeah? And again, this is because these are old laws that are still on our statute books that people don't know exist, and nobody has ever said, well, why are we still doing that, right? And how unsound mind, what does that mean? How do you know? Is it that you're just going to look at me and say, well, I am looking kind of weird, so I can't be a juror, right? And also, if you don't have these people on the jury, question, if one of those people who are sitting in the box as a defendant, the criminal, what is their position? Because if you don't even allow ordinary law-abiding citizens who are blind or deaf or of unsound mind to be on a jury, if you end up before the criminal courts and you are charged with an offense and you are deaf, blind, of unsound mind, how are you going to make out, right? But then if you look at the CRPD, look at what it talks about. Creating a way for people to participate in legal proceedings either directly or indirectly, right? How do you reconcile that with what we have? And if we cannot justify why the Jury Act is like that. Why don't we get rid of that? That is one section in one act, as opposed to trying to implement 30-something provisions of the CRPD. The first country in the world to sign and ratify the CRPD is Jamaica, right? A Caribbean country. They went a step further in 2014 and they actually made the CRPD into the Disability Act. Bahamas has disability legislation as well, right? So they've combined the disabilities issues with equal opportunity. That's why you see the equal opportunities in brackets. Guyana, which is not a country that we ever think of as being so advanced and progressive, but look, they are 8 years ahead of us. So since 2010, and they were like the first country in the Caribbean to actually enact disability law. Since 2010, they have national disability legislation. And if you look at Belize and Guyana, you will see that they have gone even further than just having a disability act, because they have put provisions in their constitution that will cater for persons with disabilities. So Belize put it in the preamble, which we know from yesterday is a good and a bad thing, because the preamble tells you that the people of Belize, part of their value system is to treat persons with disabilities with dignity and respect. But the problem with those preambles is that they're not enforceable, right? Guyana has gone a step further to talk about health care. So you have the right to free medical care if you have a disability, but again, it's a double-edged sword, give and take. They're giving you the right, but that right is not enforceable. But still, they are further along the road than we are, because if we look at our section 4 or our preamble, you see nothing. No mention or recognition of anything to do with disabilities, right? So we have to kind of think, well, why are we lagging behind? And what happened in Guyana, Belize, the Bahamas, Jamaica? What happened to them that is so different to us? Because all of us have the same history, more or less we have the same kind of society. How is it that Trinidad and Tobago, which is supposed to be one of the more advanced Caribbean countries, is so far behind the curve where disabilities is concerned? And how did they get these things implemented? Because none of these acts were there from the time they became independent, right? If you just look at the years of the legislation, you'll see that. So what made them go that route? That will be interesting, because you could draw on those experiences, right? What we have right now, which I'm sure all of you all know about, and I'm always scared to bring this up, is the Equal Opportunity Act, because I think I was telling somebody I'm yet to meet a person with a disability who will tell me a good story about their interaction and use of that piece of legislation. So again, there's a lot of good in it, but it doesn't seem to be working in a way that helps people who have disabilities. It seems to be working for people who are being discriminated against on other grounds. But with disabilities, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, I would love to hear somebody stand up and tell me, I know somebody with a disability who used this act and things turned out well. I haven't met that person yet. But if you look at it, you will see that we do have something to work with, because the Equal Opportunity Act is the only piece of legislation on our statute books that actually outlaws discrimination on the basis of a disability, right? So it says that you can't, and if you look at what it applies to: employment, education, the provision of goods and services, and the provision of accommodation. Once you are experiencing discrimination in those areas and you qualify under the grounds of status, which is what the Equal Opportunity Act deals with, then you should be able to get redress. But I don't think that that is happening. One of the reasons why I don't think it's happening is because of this. Once I finish this slide, I'll take the question. The Act gives a lot, so it's good because we do have recognition that you should not discriminate against somebody on the basis of their disability, but, you know, it takes away with by the same token. So you do have this unjustifiable hardship defense, which I think is what trips up a lot of people when they try to use the Act in order to get redress for a person with a disability. Because and it's interesting because that defense was there, but then the Act was amended in 2001 to make the unjustifiable hardship defense even more specific in terms of what it covers. So this is a little trick. The unjustifiable hardship defense is in section 14 of the Act. The factors that you look at in determining whether you could actually plead that defense is in section 18A. Once you are looking through legislation and you see a number followed by a capital letter, that means that that provision was not there originally. It was inserted by an amendment. So section 14 was always there when the Equal Opportunity Act first came into existence. Section 18A was added in 2001, right? And I want to make that point because one of the things that we are all thinking is, why don't we change laws? Why do we leave bad laws on the statute books? Well, we do change them. It's just what do we change them to? And when we do decide to change them, what is the thinking and policy that goes into that decision-making process? So to me, what the unjustifiable hardship defense, by particularizing it like that, to say that you will look at the nature of the benefits or the detriment, you will look at the effect of the disability, and all of this is being done in the context of employing a person with a disability. And that last one, you will look at the financial circumstances of the organization or the employer and how much money will it require for them to accommodate this person with a disability. If you're talking about discrimination on the basis of sex or race, it probably wouldn't require any money, right? But if you're talking about discrimination in the context of a disability, it is likely to require some kind of financial outlay. And once it does, the employer is going to claim unjustifiable hardship. So I don't know if this is true or not, but this is my working theory. My theory is that the reason why I've never met a person with a disability who has a good story about this act is because of section 14 and 18A. It doesn't look that sinister when you look through the act itself. But when you think about the kinds of issues or the kinds of discrimination that a person with a disability who is seeking employment will face, it's almost like a built-in defense that is given to the employer. Yeah, and even on top of that, on top of the defenses, the act doesn't apply at all to certain things. So it doesn't apply to an occupational requirement, which is necessary. If you are making a distinction between two people on the basis of sex, and the reason why you're doing that is because you genuinely need a man to do this job as opposed to a woman or vice versa, that will not violate the act, even though you may be discriminating, right? Religious shops, I don't know what that is. I don't know what a religious shop is, but it's in the act, right? domestic workers who experience a lot of discrimination, they cannot use the Equal Opportunity Act at all. It doesn't apply to them. And I'm seeing people in their browser, this is what is there. And we have to think why. Who came up with this? Which group started to push back when they got wind that the Equal Opportunity Act was coming on the horizon to get these things? And how much power did they have to get not just a defense, but a total exemption, right? Single-sex educational schools, that the Equal Opportunity Act doesn't apply to them at all, right? I see you're laughing, but this is what is there. Go and pull up the act and read it for yourself. It doesn't apply to sports. I don't know what is a privilege connected to pregnancy or childbirth. Those are not my words. That is what is in the act. I have had 2 kids, possibly. But is that a privilege? No, I don't think so. Getting maternity leave, I don't see it as a privilege, or maybe that's what they think. Membership in a club, right? A NGO, which I find is so hilarious. A NGO, a charity, or a religious body. The act does not apply to you, which means that an NGO could discriminate against somebody based on their disability, and there is absolutely nothing that person could do. The church could do it too, and there is nothing, right? So that sounds so crazy and weird, and that's why it will be interesting for somebody one day to study this act, to see how did we get it. Was there public consultation? Who decided to put these provisions in it? But I suspect that that is why the act doesn't work. And if we know that it's not working, one of the things we have to think about as well, the same way that those people got these provisions inserted, how can I do that and get this act changed? Right? And as I said, I don't have any empirical evidence, so don't quote me or say that I said and I'm a lawyer. So I know this is just my working theory, that it is because of the way that the act is designed, that's why it is working for some forms of discrimination, but it's not working for others. The next 2 slides is just to give you an idea of how the act actually works in terms of what are the bodies that are created. So if you have a complaint, the first body that you'll interact with is the commission, and they will kind of evaluate the complaint. They have a lot of functions other than dealing with complaints too. One of the things is preparing guidelines. Anybody has the Equal Opportunity Commission guidelines on how to avoid discriminating against a person with a disability? Right? Another thing that they are supposed to do is develop programs to combat discrimination and promote equality. They're supposed to review the working of the act. So maybe if you want something changed, one of the bodies that you could approach is the commission. If you could show them, present a case that this act is not working for persons with disabilities, and remind them that one of their functions is to review how the act works. Maybe that is a way that you could get a foothold into making an amendment to the act, that they could recommend it to the executive, as opposed to you, one person sitting down behind a computer looking at this thing and thinking, what, this can't be right. Yeah? If the commission thinks you have a case, then it goes to the tribunal. And there has been a lot of debate about whether that tribunal is the best way to deal with complaints, because it's headed by people who don't have legal training. So only one of the persons has, and this, I mean, you know, this is probably an example of attorneys thinking they know what is best, right? I think it's a good thing that there are 2 people who are not attorneys on it, because as I said, people who don't have legal training see things very, very differently. And so it's probably good because they will probably come to the best and most practical decision in the end. But that composition actually led to the Surat case. Somebody challenged the act to say that it was unconstitutional to have people who are not judges performing judicial functions. That, I don't think so. It could be, I'm not sure. But I know that somebody brought a case against the state saying that the Equal Opportunity Act was unconstitutional. And that is what they challenged. You had people performing judicial functions, but they are not judges. And remember the separation of powers that we learned about, right? You can't give judicial power to people who don't have the protection of that judges have in the Constitution. That's what they argued, and they didn't succeed. Right? So that's probably why we have the act at all. I think Ms. Crane, you had wanted to say something about the national policy. Uh-huh.
There will be legislative amendments with respect to inequality. By year-end 2017. Have you heard about it? Have you got a status report on it?
No, I don't. I didn't even know that they were looking at that. I don't.
If you look at it's on the website. The publication is on the website, dated June last year.
I thought that what they were trying to do was fix sex to include sexual orientation. I know they're doing that. But I never heard them saying that they're going to try to see if this unjustifiable hardship defense is workable in the context of a disability, which is what I am interested in looking at. But I'll still look at what you said.
Yeah, I wonder, you'll go about looking,
Yeah.
verifying if it has been amended or when it will be amended.
But what I think is that people need to know that this is a state of play. You can't get something changed if you don't know what what you have, or whether what you have is working. And that's why it will be interesting. I don't know how many persons with disabilities have actually tried to use the act, but I have never met anybody who had a good result or felt like they were treated fairly. So there's that tells me something, because this is the only act we have that protects against discrimination on the basis of disability. So I should not be searching to find somebody who has successfully used it on that basis. There should be a lot of people, because this is all they have. That's the point I'm kind of trying to make. Yeah? And then anybody else had a question about the Equal Opportunity Act? Because another area of law, or another act that you all should probably know, is the Freedom of Information Act. As advocates, that is a good, if you know that act, you could use it to your advantage, because what I hear a lot of people complaining about, and I think it was raised yesterday, is information. We don't know. Do you know? Do you know somebody else who knows? This kind of, we like to do the shoo-shooing. That's what I call it. Shoo-shoo policy, right? That contributes to breakdown of institutions, right? Because once the shoo-shooing is working and people are accepting that, you're not going to actually hold institutions responsible for what they are supposed to do. So we're not supposed to be, you got the policy, anybody who have it, somebody could send me a copy. No, right? You have a right of access to information from a public authority. That Freedom of Information Act has done that. And it's early on in the act, you can't miss it, like Section 3. And it goes further to say not only do you have this right of access, but it says that it shall be your right. So it not only creates the right, but it goes on to particularize, okay, well, what does this right actually mean? And remember, I told you about using shall and may. There's no may there. It is shall, which means that if you want the information from the public authority, you have a right to it. You're not asking somebody to do you a favor because they went to primary school with you or they know your aunt from somewhere, so they will, give you a blind and send you the document. No, we have to stop doing that and do things the right way, because that way we could track things and hold people accountable and make them live up to what they are supposed to be doing, right? So the scope of the act, if you look at it, you will see that a lot of bodies fall under the Freedom of Information Act, and a lot of the information that you may want as an advocate would fall under the scope of a public authority. So once you are a public authority and the act defines what that is, then you have an obligation, if a citizen makes this request, to get them the information that they need. It doesn't apply to the president. It doesn't apply to a commission of inquiry. And the president could exempt certain public authorities from the act. So recently there was an attempt to exempt the SSA, which I think failed because people actually found out that that is what they were trying to do, and they went to the parliament and raised it as an issue. But if nobody found out, then the Strategic Services Agency would have been exempt. The president had already signed the order exempting them. Yeah? Yeah, I know some people have to leave to go to another function. So if you have to, that's fine. And as I said, once you have a name on the list, you'll get the PowerPoint. So remember, I told you that law is all about give and take, right? So the act gives you something, but there are also a lot of exceptions. And what you have to know, and what a good attorney does, is learn not just the rule, but the exception to the rule, because you don't want to go off in a tizzy and say, oh, I want this and that and that and that and that, and you go through all of this energy to fill out the form, only for the public authority to come back and say, no, ma'am, actually, you can't get that, because that falls under one of the exemptions or the exceptions. So there's a little bit of a difference there. The documents that are accepted, so the exceptions to the act, are documents that you could get without having to fill out the Freedom of Information form. They're already publicly available. So it's either that they are on some kind of public register, or if you pay a fee, you will get it, or it could be part of some kind of registry. So for example, the company's registry, which tells you the name of all of the companies, you shouldn't file a Freedom of Information Act if what you're trying to find out is the name of a company, because that information is already in the public domain and you could get it some other way other than the act. So that's the exceptions. The exemptions are documents which don't have to be disclosed to you. And if you look at the list, you could kind of understand why you would want those documents to not be readily available to the public. So for example, documents containing personal information. You don't want somebody who knows that you are working at the Ministry of Education to file a FOI request asking for the salary information for every employee at the Ministry of Education, right? That is personal information which you would not want disclosed to anybody, or even legal professional privilege or financial information. Those are things that, yes, you have a right to access any document, but there are some things that the public just cannot be given access to, right? If you do a cost-benefit analysis, it's going to come down on the side of not giving you access. The important thing, though, is that even with those non-disclosable documents, you still have to do a balancing test. And if your request fits into one of those exceptions that is mentioned in section 35, the public authority has to give you access, even though the act says that the document doesn't have to be disclosed. So one of the things which I think is very interesting is that if your FOI request is to get information, and if you look through the request, you're seeing that there is evidence of unauthorized use of public funds, i.e. corruption, the information that you are requesting has to be disclosed to you, even if it is a non-disclosable document. Does everybody follow that? Or if what you are getting at, what your request gets at is injustice to an individual, does that sound like something that you could use, right? Or abuse of authority, danger to health and safety. If your FY request, if you look it through, you see that there is evidence that that is why you want this particular document. The public authority is not allowed to come back to you and say, well, the document that you have is exempt, so you can't get it. They have to disclose it to you once you could fit into those section 35 exemptions. The other one, which I find is really interesting, is if the disclosure will be in the public interest, because that's really broad and it gives a lot of discretion. And a lot of people have sued the government successfully under that basis to say that, listen, even though the act is saying that a cabinet document or the advice that is given to the government is exempt, it is in the public interest to disclose it. And once it's in the public interest, I have to get a copy of it. Yeah, so people like Afro Raymond and I think it's called Disclosure Today, the Trinidad and Tobago and Transparency International, a lot of them use that section 35 to make the argument that even though the act says that certain things should not be disclosed, they should still get a copy of what they are seeking. Yeah? So what we're going to do now is kind of put this to the test. So before we go into the group activity, I'm going to kind of walk you through, okay, now you know that the Freedom of Information Act exists and you want to use it. How do you do that? So obviously the first thing you have to do is fill out a form, because nobody is going to sit down like Miss Cleo and read your mind to say, okay, you have this problem, let me see if I could figure out what you want or what documents could help you. You have to do that. Sit down and think about what is the problem that you want to address. What are some of the kinds of documents that you think will help you, and where are you going to go? Are you going to go to which ministry? Are you going to go, because remember, if you look at how the public authority is defined, which one of those bodies do you want the information from? Because if you send it to the Parliament is not going to say, oh, well, this is really supposed to be to the THA, let me forward it across. Right? Nothing in Trinidad works that way. So you have to basically do a little bit of homework and sit down and think about what you want and where you want it from. You also have to deliver the form in mail or in person, which I have a problem with. That's not in the Act. And I think that for people who have a disability, that may not be the easiest thing to do. I don't even know when is the last time I mailed anything. And I don't know if TT Post is accessible, is it? Is TT Post accessible to all persons with a disability? I hope yes, right? Or even if to carry it in person. So if you wanted to make that freedom of information request to this, it was the 7th floor you were on where you saw the guy from Ministry of Education, how you getting there, right? So that is the reality, but it's not in the act. And another thing you have to make sure and do is sign the form. A lot of people forget to do that. And I mean, that's just, it might take months for you to get a response. And if you wait in 2 months and the response that you get is, oh, you didn't sign the form, so I can't process it, you probably won't be happy, right? So take from in front. The other thing is that there is actually a time limit, so your freedom of information form can't go into the twilight zone, which is what a lot of people have told me happens. When they file a FOI form, that's it. Crickets. The authority is supposed to respond to your request or to tell you what they are doing to help you get access to the document within 30 days. And that's why when you file that FOI form and you carry it in or you mail it in, you have to start to keep a track of dates. Because if the 30 days comes and goes, and you know the 30 days have come and gone, what you gonna do about it? So maybe part of the reason why a lot of FOI requests end up in the twilight zone is that nobody follows up, right? Because nobody probably even realizes that, listen, I have a right to have some kind of response from that public authority within 30 days. And if it comes and goes, write them, call them, go in, and you may be coming to drop the form. Well, I'm coming back to get my 30-day response in person, just like I dropped the form off in person. Yeah? The other thing is that all public authorities are supposed to have officers designated to deal with FOI requests. I don't know if that happens, but it's supposed to. That's what is in the Act. And then the third thing that you have to remember is that it is possible for the authority to tell you, I will give you access, but not right now. So it's sometimes when you have documents like things that might be going before Parliament or the Cabinet or things that the government is going to disclose anyway through the media, one of the things that the public authority might tell you is to just hold on a while, let the Parliament or media process goes through, and then I'm going to give you access to the document. That is different from telling you you can't get it at all. Because a lot of people think that if they tell me they're going to defer access, that means I'm never going to get the document. That is not what it means. It just means that you have to wait a little while longer to get it. Even if they refuse your request, there's a procedure for doing that, and they have to tell you why. If they are thinking about refusing it, they're going to issue you a notice. They're going to tell you who you could get in touch with, which is not the ministry, but a person with a name and a job title and a phone contact. And they're also going to consult with you to ask you, what is it exactly that you want? How can you change around this request so that it's not going to end up getting refused? That has to happen before they tell you you can't get the document, right? Even when they tell you that you can't get it, they have to give you reasons why, and they have to tell you that you could challenge that decision in the High Court, right? So the Freedom of Information Act has a lot of potential if, one, people know that it exists and how to use it and what they are entitled to, so that if the public authority comes back and tells you something that you know is not provided for in the Act, call them out on it. Or if you submitted a Freedom of Information request 2 years ago and it's in the twilight zone, you could do something to get it out of there. Write them and tell them Section 15 of the Act says I'm supposed to get a response. Not that I'm supposed to get a document, but I'm supposed to know what is going on with my request 30 days after I made it, and it's been 2 years. We like to talk about the US a lot, and the ADA and the IDEA. This is how they got to where they are, right? And even today, with the debate about Donald Trump trying to do away with Obamacare, they back out there on the streets. Get it? A lot of them got arrested recently because they refused to leave the office of one of the senators who was going to vote to take away health care for people with disabilities, right? So, and the reason why I like this picture is because not only does it show you what is possible, but it reinforces what I've always said. Change doesn't come easily. It takes a lot of fights and a lot of passion, but it can come. And also, when we are having these conversations about providing human rights to people, we're not, and I think this is a point that was being emphasized over and over, we have to get out of this idea that we're asking for special treatment. If one person in a society is being treated unfairly or unjustly, that's supposed to bother all of us. Because the saying today is you, tomorrow it could be me. That is true. I could be driving back to my house and get into an accident and end up with a disability, right? And then I might care a little bit more about the person who can't come into TT posts because they don't have a wheelchair access ramp.